Well, they're telling a lot of tales about Mexico, too, and it's causing some increased tensions between the United States and Mexico. And thankfully for us, we have Kurt Hackbarth, the writer, journalist with Jacobin Magazine, and also the host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast, here to help us sort through it all. Kurt, as always, thanks so much for being with us. Oh, you might be muted.
Oh, no.
Oh, might be our end. Oh, we got you.
There we go.
Perfect.
There we go. All right.
There it is. Well, Kurt, there's a lot happening, and maybe just to start with some framing here. I mean, people maybe have seen some headlines in the U.S. that there's a controversy over judicial reform in Mexico regarding some of the policies that Claudia Sheinbaum says she will continue to pursue when she ascends to the presidency here, quote unquote, Plan C. It's also called. What are these actual reforms that are taking place that have caused so much back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico?
Yeah, so what's going on now in this transition period between the AMLO administration and the incoming administration of Claudia Sheinbaum is the new Morena Congress is not wasting any time. As we saw on the June 2nd elections, Morena didn't just win. They won a supermajority in both houses of Congress, in both the House of Deputies, Mexico's version of the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And a supermajority in state houses. Mexico has 32 states. It's a federal system like the United States, which means that Morena and its allies can now pass constitutional level reforms on their own without having to consult with the opposition. The opposition had blocked a series of reforms over the previous years before this election. So what Morena did was, AMLO laid out a series of 20 constitutional reforms in February, and he said, we're running on this. This is the Plan C that you mentioned. And that includes a judicial reform to, democratically elect judges. It includes a reform to give indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples greater rights and greater autonomy. It includes reforms to ban fracking at a constitutional level, to ban open pit mining, to peg the minimum wage to inflation, to increase workers' pensions and create a fund so that workers can retire on their last salary up to a certain limit. So it's a series of progressive reforms that AMLO laid out and said, give us the supermajority so that we can pass these. And the public did, even, against, the predictions of most of the pollsters. So, the new Congress is sitting starting September 1st, and they're going to start passing these constitutional level reforms. Now, the one that is getting the most media attention internationally is the judicial reform. So, you have a real push on Morena's part to get this judicial reform going. And you see a lot of blowback from the U.S. press. You see Bloomberg, Mary Anastasio Grady saying, oh, my God, they're going to do judicial reform. We have to short the peso, right? All kinds of kind of financial coup kind of things. Let's hit the peso hard so that they can't do these reforms, and especially the judicial reform. The kind of the typical sneering from the New York Times saying that Mexico is going to shift, and I'm quoting here, from a judiciary based on an appointment system based on specialized training and qualifications to one where just about anyone can become a judge with a law degree and a few years of experience. Just this sneering elitism just dripping out of the New York Times that, heaven forbid, just about anyone could become, a judge in Mexico, rather than the coterie of elite judges that we have now in Mexico that cater absolutely to corporate interests and the interests of the wealthy, both national and international. And this is what the United States is worried about. They won't have the judiciary in their pocket anymore for multinationals, multinational mining companies, multinational energy companies to get injunctions, to block legislation, to block any kind of progressive reforms that prevent them from doing whatever they want in Mexican territory, basically.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's just so anti-democratic to be attacking this and to try to frame it as something that's like so horrific. I'm sorry, what's the system that they want supposed to look like? The US system, where a bunch of right-wing crazy judges take over so they can archaically remove people's rights so we can go back 150 years? I mean, sorry, now I'm opining, but it's just so insane. All that said, can you talk a bit about AMLO's response? Because I think it's a pretty strong response. And, I think for a country like Mexico, it isn't easy to respond in a defensive capacity against such a big country like the U.S., because Mexico has a lot to lose when it comes to this massive country that'll just try to eat it up if it doesn't abide by exactly what America wants. So what has AMLO's response been? And moreover, what has the public's response been? Because there is a lot of right-wing media that I don't know, you can elaborate on this, but there is a lot of right-wing media in Mexico that will push the U.S. line on things.
Yeah, the public is overwhelmingly supportive of the judicial reform. From polls up from 70, even up to 80% of the public, support this reform. And it makes sense. If you've ever had to deal with the judiciary in Mexico, from anything to a minor infraction up to, a federal case, you know what's involved with regards to bribes and delays and, cases that can go on for years and years and years. And, just this obscene level of corruption where, wealthy people just go through a revolving door in Mexico. They go in and the judges free them and they're back out, right? With a system which called here the sabadazo, which is the Saturday blow. Judges very frequently let wealthy people off on Saturdays thinking that nobody will be able to do anything until Mondays when they're out the door. Right. And so you a series of former governors and former, politicians accused of the worst things, out the door, out the door, out the door. Right. And you also saw in this administration, the Supreme Court, very much like the U.S. Supreme Court, batting back progressive reforms, one after the other, on minor technicalities. You'd never seen the Mexican Supreme Court so active until AMLO and Morena took power. And all of a sudden they're batting everything back. So, for example, in something like the energy reform, which was very important, it was an attempt by Mexico to reassert public control over its energy sector and its electrical grid. The first injunction comes in 6 hours after it's passed, and then another injunction, and another injunction. And so they suspend the whole law, right? So this is the way that they're using lawfare to freeze, the entire attempt to remold the country in the courts. Unlike U.S. Democrats, Morena is not sitting on their hands on this, right? The electoral reform provides for a total renovation of the Supreme Court, next year. And now the Supreme Court is going to have to be elected, right? As will all the other federal judges. There'll be term limits on the Supreme Court. There are term limits now, but the term limits will be reduced to 12 years. How nice would it be in the U.S. if Supreme Court judges were limited to 12 years, right? There will now be a disciplinary tribunal that will have the power to punish judges and suspend and even get rid of corrupt judges. Imagine if there were a disciplinary tribunal in the U.S. that could go after Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito for their all expenses paid trips around the world by, Republican donors who have cases before the Supreme Court, right? This is what Mexico's doing. They are creating a people-powered judiciary, which actually has real teeth to go after corrupt judges and not just have to sit on their hands and have 5 judges or 6, be dictators for life, basically. So, in light of all that, U.S. Ambassador Ken Salazar, who actually had come out 2 months ago and had said something very logical. He said, judicial reform is Mexico's business, which it is. It's Mexico's business and nobody else's, right? And even a few days, before his more controversial statement, he'd said, well, I support the judicial reform because in Colorado, where I was attorney general, we have retention elections for judges, right? His own state, and it works fine, and I'm in favor of it. Well, obviously somebody up above didn't like, Ken kind of going off the cuff like that, and so they put their thumb down on him. So a few days later, Salazar comes out with this very blunt statement saying the exact opposite. That the judicial reform is bad and it's going to undermine judicial independence, as if the judiciary were independent now, and it's basically going to turn Mexico into Iraq or Afghanistan. He really said this. 2 countries the United States invaded and occupied. Those are the examples he used. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that he would use Iraq and Afghanistan as examples of states that don't have an independent judiciary. Why don't those countries have independent judiciaries, right? And then at the end of the letter, here comes the threat, right? Because the U.S. never comes out with anything that doesn't have either a direct or an implicit threat. And the threat is our commercial relationship will be endangered by this, right? This is the key. Right, that's the threat, which you were talking about, Ronnie. It's very difficult for Mexico to assert its sovereignty in the face of these kinds of threats. right? So the U.S. line is that the U.S., and this is something the Wall Street Journal said very overtly, the U.S. has every right to opine on this because Mexico's judiciary affects what happens to U.S. companies in Mexico. So basically, the free trade agreement means that they can have an opinion on anything and everything, right? So what does AMLO say? He said very clearly, this is none of your business. Right? It's none of your business. And, a couple of days later, he said, and I think you put the video on Breakthrough News, our relationships with the U.S. Embassy are on pause. So basically, butt out, Ken, in so many words. It's a way to kind of thread the needle, right? Because you can't freeze relationships with the United States fully. That would lead to a full-blown diplomatic crisis, whatever else. So he said, basically, we're putting the relationship with the embassy on pause until Salazar and the coterie over there decide to mind their own business. And he did the same thing with the Canadian embassy, which had come out with a similar statement, a little bit weaker. And he was actually quite critical of Canada for following along the U.S.'s lead like some kind of, sad client state. AMLO ate his Wheaties this week. He was really, he's going out with both guns a-blazing here. But, that caused then Salazar to backtrack and said, I didn't really mean all that, although that's what he said. Mm-hmm. And we respect Mexico's sovereignty, but we're still worried about the judicial reform, and we're open to dialogue about it. And it's like, you still don't get it. Right. No dialogue. This is not a dialogue issue. Right? International issues are dialogue issues, right? Trade issues are dialogue issues. Our judiciary system is not a dialogue issue. Just imagine if the Mexican ambassador, Esteban Moctezuma, in Washington, put out a 2-page statement criticizing Biden's judicial reform, which, incidentally, has some of the similar, tenets of what Mexico's trying to do. Term limits, an ethics commission, right? It's very similar. Imagine if the Mexican ambassador said, I'm going to come out and have a press conference about it. They would run him out of the country in 5 minutes. But the United States thinks that they can, and their allies in the media, opine on what Mexico does and doesn't do with their own judiciary system. It's, imperialism takes many masks. Sometimes it's, Laura Richardson in Chile, but sometimes it's, the ambassador coming out with stuff like this.
Mm. Yeah, it's a crucial point on so many pieces. And I'll just ask you this finally, Kurt. I mean, there's an element of this that I think all of us who followed Latin America for a while have always noted about U.S. policy is there's a fear of a good example element to it. The way you laid out everything AMLO's doing, I feel like there's so many tens of millions of people who would be like, that sounds totally legitimate, totally fantastic. You can look at facts like, whatever we could critique him for, the fact that Bernie Sanders, dominated on the border in Colorado and California and Nevada and all these other places that, to some degree, the U.S., I'm sure, is very concerned about a range of different issues in controlling Mexico's economy. But that, in some ways, to the extent that AMLO and now Claudia Sheinbaum can carry out their full program, that it can also help link progressive people together on both sides of the border in a way that could also be dangerous to imperialism.
I think that's a great point. And I think this is a particular situation because there really is a transnational working class here, right? Not only the 126 million Mexicans, but the 37 million Mexicans of, first, second, and third generation living and working and being involved in labor issues and strike issues in the United States. And the threat of a good example is right there, right? What the U.S. Corporate class clearly wants is a judiciary that's in their pockets, right? If you just go to any mining, excavation site in anywhere of Latin America, and you can see the devastation that it causes, right? Between, in this case, U.S. and Canadian interests, right? So combined with a judicial reform in which the public elects their judges, combined with the ban on, open pit mining, and combined with that indigenous reform, which is not getting as much press, and actually it's good that it's not, so it can kind of go through, right? Which would provide greater indigenous and Afro-Mexican autonomy to decide what projects can and can't go on their territories. And that affects things like mining issues, that affects things like energy issues, and that affects things like water issues, which are going to be increasingly, more and more important in a world of climate change, where water is going to be ever more of a scarce resource, right? So if they don't have the judiciary in their pocket, it's not going to be as easy for them. Of course, they never tell you that. What they say is it's going to undermine judicial independence. It's actually going to do the exact opposite. It's going to give people a greater say in, who are the people who make these vital decisions. So you can't have multinationals coming in and putting in injunctions hours after a law is passed and suspending what, the Congress voted on. And I think that's really, really important. And one other final thing on this is it's also going to go after the excessive salaries and the excessive perks that the federal judiciary here live with. I mean, they make really stratospheric salaries. They have, they have drivers, they have vacations, they have all kinds of benefits. So it's a really kind of an in-your-face kind of excessive lifestyle, right? And as AMLO has repeatedly said, you can't have a rich government with a poor people, right? And that resonates with people. Why should we have a gilded class of judges that have everything, right? When, there are people who at times in Mexico are in jail for years because they can't post bail before even coming to trial. And many of them are indigenous people who don't even speak Spanish and have no access to a translator. That's one of the other tenets in this reform. So the idea is to actually create a justice system that is at least somewhat closer to the people. And that would be really a terrible example for people who don't want that spreading to other countries.
Well, as always, Kurt, you're on top of it all, and we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much. A pleasure.